Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 82 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Now later in today's episode, Jonathan Clements will be joining us. Jonathan is the editor and probably you could say the lead author of the well-known Humble Dollar website. Humble Dollar features really writers. There's probably 50 plus writers at this point. I am honored to be one of them. And Jonathan edits all of our writing and he does a terrific job because I enjoy writing. I'm probably a reasonably good writer. Yet every single time I submit an article to Jonathan, he is able to polish it into something so much better than what I contributed myself. Jonathan spent many years writing for the Wall Street Journal. He's got a very interesting and useful, helpful personal finance and investing thought process himself. But first, as always, I wanted to share a review of the week. This one comes from Apple Podcasts. From a user, it's not exactly an English word, but user RCHLLTHL, Richethel. Thank you for submitting this very kind review, 5-star review where you said, I love this podcast. The Best Interest cuts through the noise of bad advice with clear, research-backed personal finance strategies for the everyday investor. And you wrote that in from the Philippines, according to my sources here. So thank you, RCHLLTHL, for those very kind words. If you get this, send me an email. And as long as the postage to send a t-shirt to the Philippines isn't too outrageous, I would be happy to send you a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. And before we get to Jonathan Clements today, I wanted to do a little brief monologue. Interestingly enough, this is from an article that I've submitted to Humble Dollar. And by the time this podcast is live, most likely this article will be live on Humble Dollar. And now, for the past few years, I've been on a Radiohead kick. If you don't know Radiohead, for the uninitiated, they're an English rock band. Their lead singer is Thom Yorke. Their most famous song is called Creep, but it's very interesting, right? Creep is the song that average person on the street will have heard of, but so many of their songs are really, really good. And the more you listen to them, the more you find that some of the lesser known songs are actually terrific. Now, Thom Yorke, that lead singer, he's known for his distinctive whining vocals. And I mean that in a good way, whining in a good way, and also his innovative songwriting. And as I've gotten to know the band and learn more about them, and I read about Thom Yorke on his Wikipedia article, a quote that he said, it leapt off the page and it kind of hit me right in the face. And the quote is, when I was a kid, I always assumed that fame was going to answer something, to fill a gap. And it does the absolute opposite. End quote. Now, when I saw that, I immediately thought of the financial corollary. People assume that money will make them happier or fill some sort of void in their life. They grind and they grind and they grind until finally they reach retirement or they hit their financial independence number or cross whatever threshold occupies their mind. But does money really make us happy? Now, some studies say no. A famous 2006 study by 5 academics, including the late, great Danny Kahneman, concluded the belief that high income is associated with good mood is widespread, but mostly illusory. People with above average income are relatively satisfied with their lives, but are barely happier than others in moment-to-moment experience. They tend to be more tense, and they do not spend more time in particularly enjoyable activities. That is, just to reaffirm, that people with high income tend to be more tense and do not spend more time in particularly enjoyable activities. Now, Danny Kahneman, and a fellow scientist named Angus Deaton, they added new findings in 2010, suggesting that emotional well-being rises with income, but there's no further progress beyond an annual income of roughly $75,000. Low income exacerbates the emotional pain associated with such misfortunes as divorce, ill health, and being alone. We conclude that high income buys life satisfaction but not happiness, and that low income is associated both with low life evaluation and low emotional well-being. Okay, we'll come back to exactly what that means, but first, I want to talk about a 2021 study that adds a new important wrinkle to this kind of research. Matthew Killingsworth of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, he found that happiness kept rising with income with no limit. No limit, for example, at $75,000. Killingsworth wrote that it's a compelling possibility, the idea that money stops mattering above a certain point, at least for how people actually feel moment to moment. But when I looked across a wide range of income levels, I found that all forms of well-being continued to rise with income. I don't see any sort of kink in the curve, an inflection point where money stops mattering. Instead, it keeps increasing. Very interesting, but why, we should ask. Now, if fame couldn't fill Thom Yorke's gap, is money somehow different? Can Killingsworth research be right? Now, I personally have a suspicion, and it starts with a favorite phrase from one of my mentors. And the phrase is, I don't know if money buys happiness, but it certainly buys flexibility. It turns out that that idea is a key part of Killingsworth's theory. Higher earners are happier in part because of an increased sense of control over their lives. When you have more money, he says, you have more choices about how to live your life. You can likely see this during the COVID pandemic. People living paycheck to paycheck who lose their job might need to take the first available job to stay afloat, even if it's one they dislike. But people with a financial cushion can wait for a job that's a better fit. Across decisions big and small, having more money gives a person more choices and a greater sense of autonomy. More money equals more flexibility, more autonomy, and more satisfaction. But we're still left with a bit of a puzzle. Why did Kahneman's results disagree with Killingsworth's results? Now, fortunately, those two scientists got together in 2022 to compare notes and discuss why their conclusions were in opposition. The upshot is that it seems we need to view happiness and unhappiness not as opposites, but as separate phenomena altogether. The happiness spectrum, for example, it might show the difference between a 10-day vacation in a luxury hotel versus a 4-day vacation in a motel. Now, both are good additions to life. We'd probably accept either one, but more money buys you the better of those two. But what about unhappiness? Money can put a roof over our heads. It can put food in our stomachs, preventing those two unhappy outcomes. But a lot of unhappiness in life is untethered from money. Money can't cure a disease. It can't necessarily prevent a messy divorce or change the chemical imbalance in your brain. The $75,000 threshold, according to Kahneman and Killingsworth in their final study, they said it may represent the point beyond which the miseries that remain are not alleviated by high income. Heartbreak, bereavement, and clinical depression may be examples of such miseries. Kahneman and Killingsworth, their joint research allows us to answer two crucial questions. Can money increase happiness? Yes, and seemingly without limit. The nicer and nicer and nicer vacation, those are nice things, and we'd rather have that 10-day vacation in the nice hotel than the 5-day vacation in the motel. But can money decrease unhappiness? The answer there is yes, but only to a point. Now, the armchair psychologist in me would guess that fame works similarly in Thom Yorke's case. While fame might have made certain highs even higher, it, like money, can't address many of life's lows. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you, but I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog. And with that, I now want to bring on Jonathan Clements to the podcast. Jonathan is the founder and the editor of Humble Dollar. He's also the author of a fistful of personal finance books, including My Money Journey and How to Think About Money, both of which we talk about today. Jonathan spent almost 20 years at the Wall Street Journal, where he was the newspaper's personal finance columnist. Between October 1994 and April 2008, he wrote 1,009 columns for the Journal and for the Wall Street Journal Sunday edition. He then worked for 6 years at Citigroup, where he was the director of financial education for Citi's personal wealth management, before returning to the Wall Street Journal for an additional 15-month stint as a columnist. And as I alluded to earlier, Jonathan now spends his time running Humble Dollar, which is a very, very educational, well-done, creative personal finance website. If you subscribe to my weekly newsletter, you'll recognize Humble Dollar, because I'd say most weeks I end up sharing an article that has Jonathan's fingerprints on it, either because he was the author or because he edited it to its final form. So without further ado, here is Jonathan Clements. Jonathan, thank you for joining us on the Best Interest podcast. And I was looking at My Money Journey, your book, and we can talk about that in some detail. And it includes 30 stories from 30 different people about their unique financial paths. Some are smooth, some are bumpy, some are triumphant, some have some disasters in there. And I'm curious, which of those stories actually had the biggest influence on you in your personal financial life, and why?
Well, all of them had an influence on me to the extent that I, to a degree, know all of the contributors. I mean, all of them have also written for this website I run, humbledollar.com. And so even before I received their essays, I knew a lot about them. But to me, it's sort of like hearing the personal stories of a colleague. A lot of the details, but see it all in one place is really interesting. In terms of the specific stories, I certainly saw something of myself in Mike Zaccardi. Mike Zaccardi is the youngest contributor to the book. He's in his mid-30s now. Mike is a classic example of a super saver, which I certainly was from very early on. Not as early as Mike, and I wasn't as successful as Mike, partly because I, had this habit of having children, and that's an expensive preoccupation. Nonetheless, Mike, by the time he got into his early 30s, had amassed a 7-figure portfolio. Super impressive for somebody so young. But even as Mike amassed that portfolio, he also became more philosophical. I mean, this big goal he set for himself, let's get a 7-figure portfolio. He realized that maybe he'd been too frugal, that maybe money in and of itself is not the goal, it's not enough, and that maybe he was missing out on life. And I found that really interesting. It certainly made me reflect on my financial journey, which early on did involve some pretty severe frugality, partly out of necessity, because I was a poorly paid journalist in New York City. But also, even now that I have plenty of money, learning to spend has been a struggle for me, and I can see that it's certainly been a struggle for Mike.
It's not only a struggle for you and Mike. It's funny. I know on Humble Dollar, which, by the way, I think many listeners are going to be familiar with because Humble Dollar articles often make it into the Best Interest newsletter that goes out weekly. Humble Dollar, there will be people writing about financial independence. Retirement is a very, very frequent topic on Humble Dollar. And in both of those ideas, whether it's the financial independence movement or just retirees who have been saving and saving and saving forever, switching from saver to spender is this constant theme in personal finance. And in your time of editing, you created Humble Dollar and now you're the editor and you see all the articles have your fingerprints on them. I assume, is that some sort of recurring theme that you either see from your writers or just from the readers who are frequently commenting on Humble Dollar?
I see it in both. And there's a reason that people are financially successful. And it's a reason, it's a theme that runs through the book, My Money Journey, which is that, people who are financially successful normally aren't great investors. They often make a lot of financial mistakes, but the one common trait is they are great, great savers. They've saved diligently for 3 or 4 decades. That's how they've amassed enough for financial independence. But having been so diligent about saving for all those decades, it's awfully hard to turn around and start spending that money. I mean, for 80% of Americans, spending money is not a problem. It is not a big issue in this country being able to spend. But for those people who are frugal, who have had this lifetime habit of socking away money month after month, year after year, turning around and starting to spend that nest egg is a struggle.
Yeah, there's a bit of a Goldilocks situation going on, is there, where it's too hot, too cold, and not many people are able to strike that perfect balance in their own lives. Too much spending, too much saving, but it's hard to find that right balance.
And I think one of the things that people discover as they get older is 2 things happen. I mean, one is they reach a point where they realize there's no way you're going to spend all of this money. So, hey, I might as well spend some of it on myself. 2, as you get older, and I'm 61, so I sort of, I look ahead to the people around me who are my age and somewhat older, and I realize that come the mid to late 70s, a lot of people lose their taste for this sort of exotic travel that we think is part of retirement. By the time you get to 75, 80, climbing on a plane to make a transatlantic trip becomes a big deal. I mean, even for me now at 61, sitting upright in coach for 6 or 7 hours on an overnight flight to London or Paris is a daunting prospect. And the other thing that, people come to appreciate is the joy of giving away money, not just to charity, but also to their family. And certainly for me, and certainly for a lot of the readers of Humble Dollar and the contributors to it, giving away money becomes a great source of joy. It's certainly something that is probably my biggest expenditure in 2024 is giving away money. And I think that's also true for a lot of the people who are involved with the site.
It's really interesting too, because I would assume that many of the younger listeners right now, maybe in their 20s and their 30s, that's not something on their radar at all. Or if it is, it's maybe a pretty small budget line item. But it just shines a light on the fact that as we grow older, our priorities change, whether it's spending priorities, maybe it's lifestyle priorities like the travel priority that you just mentioned. But it is important for long-term savers, long-term investors, anyone planning for the long run, to be self-aware to the fact that what you think is important right now might not be important in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Jesse, that is such an important point. We are very bad at anticipating what we will want in the future. I mean, the life that I envisaged at this age and what I thought I really wanted is totally separate from what I want now. And this is almost laughable, but I came across to the States from London in 1986. I was in my early 20s and I started learning about US personal finance, stock market returns, what it takes to retire and so on. And I had this very simple notion and this very simple dream, which was I imagined that if by the time I was 40 or so, I had amassed $250,000 and I put that in the stock market and I could notch 7 percentage points a year more than inflation, that I would have $1 million at retirement and I would be financially free. And then over those final 20 years, while I was earning those 7 percentage points a year, above inflation like clockwork, I would be able to do pretty much whatever I want as long as I had a little money coming in. I mean, the naivete of that, to imagine that 1, retirement is all about the money. 2, that the stock market is going to clock 7 percentage points a year above inflation like clockwork. And 3, that I was really going to be happy for a couple of decades, basically not having a career, just making a little bit of money. I was out of my head. I mean, as I've got older, what I've discovered is doing nothing, which seems so tantalizing when you're in your 20s and 30s, that thing, I can't wait for the weekend and I can't wait till every day is a weekend and I don't have to go to the office and I don't have to do any work. When you get to my age, 61, it's like, hey, doing that work is actually pretty fulfilling and doing nothing is really pretty boring. Yeah. And you need a sense of purpose. You need a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And I'm at the point where I'm not sure I'm ever going to retire. I certainly want to work less, but I'm not sure I will ever call it quits entirely.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think the title of your book, My Money Journey, it is journey, right? And I think back, you're reminding me, Jonathan, of Fritz Gilbert. Do you know Fritz Gilbert? The Retirement Manifesto is his blog. But he writes a lot about retirement topics. And one thing that stuck from my conversation with Fritz is this idea that a lot of retirees face, whether you want to call it depression or a little bit of malaise or just a little bit of, they're a little kind of unmoored in their life and their direction. And often it's just tied back to this fact of careers gave us so much direction and so much purpose. And then going from 100 down to 0, just flipping that switch off is really hard. And they don't have anything to retire to. So maybe it's work, maybe it's just side hobbies or just volunteering. It's some sort of direction in retirement. Because I think, I'm not a psychologist, but I know enough people to know that a lot of people enjoy doing stuff. You need something to do, something to give you a purpose, something to occupy your time. The idea of retiring to just the proverbial beach and mojitos, I don't think as many people actually are going to enjoy that as they might think.
One of the things that a lot of us have in our heads is that, life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short, that we're going to keel over at any moment. And so we tend to not only run our financial lives that way, but we also plan the rest of our lives that way, that I may not be here tomorrow, so I better, 1, make sure I'm out of the way of any potential stock market decline, but 2, I better enjoy today in that sort of conventional fun way. I better party, I better go out to dinner, I better do this traveling now because I may not be here to do that next year. But at my not so grand age of 61, It's entirely possible. And if this doesn't happen, you'll be playing this clip and people will be laughing their asses off. But it's entirely possible that I can live another 3 decades. Am I really going to spend 3 decades relaxing?
Right.
I mean, that would be all, half of my adult life spent doing nothing. Is that really what I want to do? And the answer is no, of course not. I mean, if I knew that I was going to make it to my 90s, I would be completely motivated to keep working part-time. I would take on longer-term projects. I would think about self-improvement. Why wouldn't you launch a new business in your 60s if you knew you were going to make it to your 90s? And yet we have this mentality, well, it could all be over tomorrow, so not going to do that. I'm going to go and have, fun. And I think it's a big mistake. Obviously, some people do keel over tomorrow, but for most people, they are going to make it into their 80s. If they're in their 60s, they're going to make it into their 80s, and they should be thinking with a longer-term focus.
That's probably a Danny Kahneman thing where it's much easier for us to focus on the proverbial tiger in the grass, that giant risk that's waiting just around the corner, and it occupies too much of our brain space. And when we forget the fact that actually the probabilities are in our favor and we're going to live longer than the most risk averse of us might think. Going back to my money journey, Jonathan, I was looking online earlier and I found this list of 8 traits that I want to say you put together as you were writing the book, but it's a list of 8 traits that successful investors tend to have in common. Can you walk us through either some or all of that list?
Well, Jesse, the first one I want to mention is the obvious one and the one that we've already talked about, which is the key to financial freedom is good savings habits. And it's so obvious, and yet it can't be said often enough. I mean, if you want financial freedom, you need to be able to control your spending and you need to sock away great gobs of money. If you haven't heard that lesson, if you haven't embraced it, embrace it now, because that is going to be the key to financial freedom. If you can't control your material desires, your entire life is going to be a struggle. So for goodness sake, get a grip on your spending. The other one that I think is important, particularly from my perspective at the other end of the journey, is it's important to have some sense for what is enough. Most of us spend our lives focusing on having more this, more that. But when you get to my age, you need to look at your portfolio and say, yeah, that is enough. That is enough for me. I mean, all in favor of trying to set goals and write them down so that you don't keep moving the goalposts. So if you think your magic number is 1.5 million when you are age 45, you should write $1.5 million on a piece of paper and stick it on the refrigerator so that 15 years later, you don't think, hey, I really need $4 million. I really need $5 million. Because if you have that mentality, if you keep moving the goalposts, you will never be satisfied. And I would actually also say this about career success as well. At some point, we should all step away from the corporate ladder, pursuing those pay raises and promotions and say, I have had enough success as defined by society. And what I really want to focus on is things that I find personally satisfying. Hopefully things that can also make you a buck or two, but things that you find personally satisfying. So both in terms of career and in terms of money, you need to have goals where you say that is enough, and then allow yourself to move on and focus on what I would argue are more important matters.
Well, there's a phrase in retirement planning, 1 more year syndrome is what they call it, right? And I've heard it both in traditional retirement planning and also in financial independence, where people set their goals, they know their FI number, or they work with a CFP who's laid out with them, well, based on your lifestyle, here's where you need to be. And they get there, and technically speaking, the math works out. I think it goes back to some sort of psychological hitch, for lack of a better term, where the math can work out all good, but something in these people's brains says, I'm just too worried. There's an anxiety. It's what if I quit now? What if there's a market crash, a sequence of returns problem, and then I need to go back to work? I'd rather just work 1 more year. Were there any specific stories or specific writers in the book that was just a really poignant part of their story?
That's a good question. I actually edited the book 2 years ago at this point, Jesse.
Yeah, totally fair.
I cannot actually remember all of the stories and the level of detail where people said, I'm going to do one more year. But certainly this has actually become a bit of a hobby horse for me now. I wrote an article earlier this year, and the headline was Fire Meets Ice. So FIRE, of course, is financial independence, retire early. And ICE is an acronym I created, which stands for I'll continue earning. And I think that continuing to earn a little bit of money through part-time work, through your early retirement years, is psychologically enormously comforting. It really is hard, as we've already discussed, to turn around and start spending down this heap of savings that you've amassed. And it's comforting to have a little bit of money continuing to come in. And that's why I think part-time work early in retirement is a great idea. Hopefully it's part-time work where you have the flexibility to do the traveling you want and so on. But remember, one of the reasons why people are reluctant to leave the workforce isn't just because they give up the paycheck. They also lose their identity. And if you continue to do some work and get paid for it, you have an identity. I mean, nobody wants to walk around a cocktail party saying, hey, I'm a retiree. That is not a label that any of us want. What we want to do is say, I'm a freelancer. I do this. I have this little business where I do X. I do some consulting, whatever it is. We all want an identity, and what we do for a living provides that identity.
Well, speaking of part-time work, I found an article that you wrote. I want to say it was last year, Jonathan, but you might know better than me. But it's called Jonathan's Retirement. Is that relatively new? Maybe the last 12 or 18 months?
So actually, that part of the site is part of what I call the money guide. So there's this backbone of the site is this money guide with little write-ups on a host of different topics, everything from how much you should save to something you mentioned, sequence of return risk, and so on. So Jonathan's Retirement is simply a recap of my retirement strategy, which is ever evolving, but it is reasonably accurate.
Got it. Okay. So if it's okay, I actually wanted to share some of the high level details from that, but then I want to dive into a few of those ideas because I think they're very interesting and it kind of brings about some topics that we don't talk about too much here on the Best Interest podcast. So we were talking earlier about part-time work. You say that you're semi-retired right now. Humble Dollar keeps you as busy as ever. You've reduced some of your spending, mainly through a move from the New York City area to outside of Philadelphia. You plan on delaying Social Security until age 70, which is common for people who are in a comfortable financial circumstances and are likely to lead a long life, which we talked about. Now, your portfolio, even though you're semi-retired, you said you're 61 years old, you're about 80% stocks, 20% bonds right now. You don't plan on using the traditional 4% rule, but instead plan on using a roughly 5% rule, although you've mentioned in the article that you're very willing to be flexible in bad markets. And the last one, perhaps the most interesting one from my point of view, is you're considering buying immediate fixed annuities to provide lifetime income to supplement Social Security income. So I'd love to dive into those last three ideas. As I said, they aren't retirement thoughts that you hear every day. Maybe let's start with the lifetime annuity. Could you explain what a fixed lifetime annuity is and what some of your thought process is behind that?
So an immediate fixed annuity simply involves handing a sum of money over to an insurance company, and in return, they'll cut you a check every month. On occasion, it's for a specified period of time, like 5 or 10 years. But what I'm talking about are lifetime income annuities. The best income annuity, of course, is Social Security, and that's why I'm planning to delay Social Security until age 70, so I get the largest monthly check possible. According to the Social Security website, if I delay till 70, I will get $55,500 a year, which will easily cover my fixed living costs, plus that goes up with inflation every year. To supplement that, I plan to buy some income annuities to provide additional income on top of that, cover travel expenses and stuff like that. So people say, oh, well, that's a super conservative strategy. You're basically turning this money over to an insurance company in return for, lifetime income. But I would argue that actually what this does is free me up to be super aggressive. I mean, I've carried a high stock allocation throughout my life. And while it says on the website that, my target is 80, right now I'm actually closer to 90% in stocks. And people say, how can you be 61 years old and have 90% in stocks? Well, one is because I know that between Social Security and these income annuities, when I buy them, that I won't need to rely on my portfolio for income every year. I will have plenty of money if the market nosedives 50%. Moreover, on top of that, Social Security, on top of those income annuities, I do have a portion of my portfolio allocated towards short-term bonds. And people say, well, why is your target only 20%? Work with me here. I mean, there is this thing called the 4% rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
And according to the 4% rule, you can withdraw 4% inflation adjusted from your portfolio every year. And over a 30-year retirement, according to market history, you will not run out of money, no matter how bad the sequence of return is in the markets. While I don't plan to follow the 4% rule, I do think it is a useful guidepost. So let's say that I want enough money in my portfolio to make it through a terrible 5-year market. Well, you take 4%, you multiply it by 5, and that gives you 20%. So that's why I target 20% of my portfolio for short-term bonds, because that way I know I can go 5 years without pulling any money out of the stock portion of my portfolio. Now, a lot of people, when they create their stock bond mix, go by rules of thumb. Oh, I'm a balanced investor. I should have 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and so on. I don't work that way. I drive it based on how much cash I think I'm going to need for my portfolio over the next 5 years. Right now, I don't need any because I'm still earning money. But if and when I decide to retire, the most I'm going to be pulling over a 5-year period is going to be 20%. And so that's why I only allocate 20% to short-term bonds.
I like that a lot. And that's a bottoms-up portfolio construction, very much math-based, which I'm a fan of. We've talked around words on the podcast before, goals-based investing, or something I've called the bucket method, although the problem is other people have a bucket method that has a completely different definition. So maybe the bucket method isn't great verbiage, but goals-based investing is good verbiage, or a bottoms-up portfolio is good verbiage, which is to say, let's give our dollars a job. Let's give them a timeline, which is most important. And then based on that timeline, we can back into what the appropriate amount of investment risk we can take is. And then we can back into, based on that investment risk, what kind of asset class is appropriate. And absolutely, it's something, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, in your case, Jonathan, maybe the more conservative person would say 8 years. Those kind of near-term assets should be allocated to bonds. Anything in the long run should be allocated to something heavier in risk, stocks being kind of the most common example. And it's very understandable for someone. Essentially what I'm saying is it shouldn't be based on age, right? Just because you can say, well, I'm 60 years old, I should therefore be 60-40. Certainly not. We have to talk about the unique circumstances in someone's life and the unique needs for money over time, and even their risk tolerance. And something you've outlined is that your annuities give you the ability to be more risk tolerant. And going back to the annuities just for one quick second, whether it's the annuities that you're looking at specifically or just your general knowledge of these fixed lifetime annuities, what kind of payout do you receive from the annuity once it's annuitized? And roughly speaking, what kind of fees are involved there?
Annuity is a dirty word, and it deserves to be a dirty word. I mean, there are all kinds of atrocious annuities out there. There are these, index-linked annuities. There are these variable annuities. This is not what I am talking about.
Right.
If somebody tries to sell you a variable annuity, run in the opposite direction. If somebody tries to sell you an index-linked annuity, run in the opposite direction, but really, really fast. Annuities, as a rule, are not a good product, but immediate fixed annuities are completely different. In the academic world, finance professors are a huge fan of them. Essentially what it is just pooling your money with other investors in order to provide lifetime income. Same as with any other insurance that you might buy. When you buy homeowners insurance, you're all contributing to a pool of money out of which the people who have a disastrous year, their home burns down, whatever it is, they're the ones who collect. So similarly, with an immediate fixed annuity, what you're doing is contributing to a pool of money out of which the various people who participate are then paid, and the people who live longest get the payments for the longest possible time. It's a way of pooling risk and hedging the danger that you live to a ripe old age. There are no explicitly listed fees in an immediate fixed annuity. These are also not a product that insurance salesmen tend to push because the commissions on an immediate fixed annuity tend to be tiny. I mean, typically, from what I gather, if an insurance salesman sells an immediate fixed annuity, they will make maybe 1% of the amount that you're investing. Whereas I've seen equity indexed annuities where the commission is like 14, 15% is completely absurd. So immediate fixed annuities are a very reasonable product. You should avoid annuities generally, but this is one that I think deserves a second look.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you.
Let me hijack the conversation a little bit more, Jesse, and talk a little bit about this high equity exposure that I have.
Yeah.
One, I just want to make it clear that while I'm comfortable doing this, I've always had a high stock exposure. I realize that this is not the sort of equity exposure that most people will be comfortable with, particularly when they reach my age. But I've been very used to, market downturns. I've lived through 2000 to 2002, 2007 to 2009, the COVID crash, and so on. I mean, none of that has perturbed me. I mean, in each case, when the market was dropping like a rock, I was increasing my allocation to stocks. I don't know why I'm wired that way, but I am. So to use a phrase that's popular, why, if I've won the game, and am I continuing to play? And the reason is this: I want my two kids to inherit a healthy sum. Well, they already are working, so it's not like I'm going to leave them enough so they never have to work another day in their life. But I believe for sort of middle class, upper middle class families, there is this chance to pay it forward, to make sure that your kids and your grandkids are able to stay within the middle class. And if you manage your money properly and you not only teach them well about money, but also bequeath them a healthy sum, you will be able to replicate your position in the middle class. And that is sort of my goal. It's to make sure that my kids and my grandkids continue to be financially successful. And I do that not only by talking to my kids about money on a regular basis, talking to them about how much they can expect to inherit, trying to make sure that they have good financial habits, but also by leaving them a decent sum of money. It's very important to me.
Well, and getting back to the topic of timelines, I mean, it's very interesting that you bring that up, Jonathan, because now it's important for every investor to understand, in your particular case, that your timeline for at least a portion of your assets, it's not really your timeline per se, it's your children's timeline. And that adds decades onto whatever your timeline would have been. And an analogous scenario is when someone has the hopes of leaving a large sum of money to, say, charity or to an endowment. The University of X changed my life, and so I plan on leaving $1 million to the University of X. Well, that's probably going to be a gift that the university uses in perpetuity, or it might be. And in that case, there's a very long timeline on that particular sum of money. And so if the university had its way, they would probably say, we want you to invest it in the long run. I mean, no bonds, right? Essentially what we're getting back to here is no bonds. And so that for that portion of your particular assets that you plan on leaving to your children, again, that's where the asset allocation conversation comes back into play, because we say, yeah, it probably doesn't make sense for any bonds to be there. You want to be in kind of the longest duration assets you could find. And in your case, that leads back to this 80-20 mix that might not seem normal for every 61-year-old, but for you is very well thought out. You're very comfortable with it. And that really is ultimately important in the individual investor conversation.
So just something else to think about here. And again, I think your audience is probably somewhat younger, so this is maybe aspirational at this point. But I was a father at age 25, which is ridiculously young. Nobody should be a father that young, but I was. And so my kids are in their 30s now. And by the time I check out, they will be retirement age. They will be retired. So at that point, my money is not going to be that useful to them. So one of the things that I've taken to doing in recent years is starting to make gifts to them, because I realize the money is going to be much more useful to them now than it will be later on. I'm not going to be reckless about it, but I am starting to make financial gifts to them within the gift tax limit. And, it means a lot to them. It gives them a sense of financial security. I mean, they're both very smart about money. They have good jobs and so on and so on. So I'm not really worried about it somehow corrupting them. But it does give them an added sense of financial security. And I think that's great.
Well, that makes me think of another interesting topic, Jonathan, that I would think your career might have you really well positioned for it. And then here you are with 2 grown children. And now all of a sudden there is a pretty significant transition of assets going on. And the topic really is just conversations with your children. And maybe these are conversations that you would have had with them growing up. And for some of our younger listeners, it's conversations to have with your 8 or 10 or 12-year-old kids. But for other listeners, and for you right now, Jonathan, it's conversations to have with your adult children about the money you're earning, the wealth of the family, how you choose to spend your money. In your case, how you're choosing to gift them money. Does that topic bring about any interesting thoughts from you and your experience?
So one, yes, I think that having an ongoing conversation about money with your family from a young age is really important. But let's throw in a big caveat here, which is kids are not stupid. They will learn not just from what you say, but also from what you do. So if you spend every evening on the computer, online shopping, if the Amazon guy is your best friend, that's the lesson they're going to learn. It doesn't matter what you tell them about frugality. If you don't live those words, they will learn from what you're doing, not from what you're saying. So for goodness sake, model good financial behavior, because that is what they will learn from.
And how about on the topic of gifting? I'm just curious, are there any, not strings attached, that's the wrong way of saying it, but what is the conversation like when, as you're making these gifts, I don't know, is there any sort of greater kind of estate planning conversation that you're having with the kids at this point? Any sort of dialogue that goes along with, here's this pretty significant gift from me to you because it's probably more useful to you right now than it will be in 30 years?
So a couple of points here. One is I have been giving my kids money from relatively early on. And so they are used to handling sums of money. They've shown to me that they're not going to be profligate with it. So I don't feel like I need to sort of give them money with strings attached. I know they're going to use it sensibly. We've got over that hurdle. I mean, obviously, if you give money to your kids and they immediately squander it, the alarm bells should be going off and you should be more careful with the next gift. I mean, that's why if you're going to give financial gifts to your kids, you want to start small and work up over time so that you see how they handle it. But two, I'm super open with my kids. I mean, they know the size of my portfolio. When I revise my will, I immediately, scan it and email the PDF to them. They know who the beneficiaries are on my IRAs and so on and so on. I'm totally open about it. And I think, everybody should be. In fact, this may not sound like a wonderful experience, but in February, I flew down to Florida, to Boca Raton, where my mother lives in a continuing care retirement community. She's 84 years old, about to turn 85. And the explicit reason I went down was to spend time touring her apartment at the continuing care retirement community so that she could show me where everything was, what's really important to her, who she wants to get what. I realize, many families, money is a taboo topic and there aren't conversations like that. But in the case of my mother, she's modeling great behavior there. She's showing that she's completely open about money. And, when she goes, things should be super easy. In fact, my mother is so concerned that her passing will be super easy that my sister and I joke that if she could, she'd figure out a way to bury herself. I mean, she is so determined that it be as easy as possible for us.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing your money journey, your family's money journey, and doing so. I mean, this is going to be very punny, but doing so very humbly today. If they want to find a copy of My Money Journey, your book, if they want to read your work and the amazing roster of authors' work at Humble Dollar, how can listeners reach out to you or find the various pieces of work that you've contributed to?
check out humbledollar.com. A huge number of articles available, including, countless articles by me. We're putting up a couple of new pieces of content every day. If you dig into the site, you'll find that articles are organized by writer. So if there's a writer you like, you can go back and read their past articles. I mean, one of the things that Jesse, is that personal finance tends to be pretty timeless. People get wound up because the market went up or down today. What's it going to do tomorrow? Blah, 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 blah. But the fact is, the principles of sound personal financial management are pretty timeless. And if you come to humbledollar.com and you read a bunch of the articles, you'll get a lot of wisdom, including some wisdom from this guy called Jesse Kramer, who's written one piece for the site, and we got another one on deck by you. In terms of my books, obviously they're all available from Amazon.com. If you're going to read any of them, yes, My Money Journey, I think, is a good read. The other book for which I'm best known is a book called How to Think About Money, which came out in 2016. And it's really a book about how to think about money, about my financial philosophy. It has been the best-selling book that I have written. It's relatively easy read. It's not a long book. And if you want to see how I think and learn a bit more about managing money, I would encourage folks to pick up that one.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure we will throw links not only to Humble Dollar, but direct Amazon links to your books in the show notes. Listeners, you can check them out there. And Jonathan Clements, thank you for joining us on the Best Interest Podcast.
Hey, Jesse, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.